اللهم صل على الحبيب محمد يا رب صل عليه وسلم.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. بسم الله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. Alhamdulillah, it is a blessing and honor to be back together with you all again in this very blessed conference that we hope that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will shower upon us His abundant generosity tabaraka wa ta'ala as we expose ourselves to the sweet breezes of His mercy when we come together to learn something that we hope goes beyond our ears and is absorbed in the very depth of our being. And in the age of information, there's a lot of things being said. But the vast majority of what is being said is not really what is of benefit, especially when we really think about our definition of khair and shar, that is good and evil being. Good is that which will benefit you ultimately in the next world, and evil is that which will ultimately harm you in the next world. And so that we take from that an understanding that there are many things that happen in our lives that outwardly we don't think are good, but in reality, were the veil to be removed here in this world, are we to then experience the reality of that thing in the next world, is that we would find it to be good and vice versa. And it is in this understanding that allows us to be able to dig deep, to be able to have not only ocular vision outwardly where we can see things, but also is that with the inner eye, is that we can learn to see things beyond the surface level, is that we can learn to see things with the depths of spirit from the spiritual proportions. And so when we come together in gatherings like these are blessed opportunities that we can expose ourselves to what is of benefit. And there's no doubt that this topic, and I want to preface my comments that I have on this topic by saying we live in a very difficult time. It kind of goes without saying. But I get this sense, and maybe it's just me, maybe it's my own experience, maybe it's the fact that my conversion to Islam about 20 years ago, many of my close friends are now in their mid-40s, and we have to realize that we as Muslims are not immune to the greater trends in society, that there are probably many Muslims themselves that are going through a midlife crisis. And the way that they have to put that together, whether they entered into this religion or that whether they're trying to maintain their religion having grown up in the United States of America or wherever they're from. But we do live in a time, in my estimation, that is especially challenging for a number of reasons. And if I just think about in my own life, people that are very close to me, and I think about the challenges that they are going through, and I can't stop thinking about my closest childhood friend, whom I've known since 6th grade. In fact, we met at science camp, of all places, growing up in middle school in the South Bay of the San Francisco Bay Area. My childhood friend, Osama Cannon, just to know the difficulty that he is going through at this moment, as the symptoms of ALS are causing him to deteriorate more and more and more, and to be with someone and to see that how this is affecting his family and those that are around him. But it's not just him, that a long list of other people that are going through very difficult tribulations in many ways, is that, and then in the broader context of the ummah, everything that they are going through, but especially those that have chosen to dedicate their life to this deen and to try to teach people that, in my experience, is that they are especially going through tribulations in our time. And I think that we can assume for this reason, and then just in general, the state of human beings in the modern world in which we all live. Oftentimes when we come to gatherings like this, when we come to conferences, or we go to the masjid and we hear a khutbah, or we're teaching a class, or we're doing some type of video, or we're interacting with some type of person, we assume that everything is okay. And we assume that those people are not wounded in some way. Not just physically, but something else, emotionally or spiritually or whatever you may have it. And I think that what I'm really trying to get at, I'm not so sure that we can make that assumption. The more and more you meet with people and the more and more that you realize how difficult this time really is. And I think some of the assumptions that people might have had and their experience in this time, oftentimes overseas, don't necessarily apply to our particular context. And I used to say this to my teachers, whom the vast majority are from overseas. And when you would learn in the books of jurisprudence the exceptions, so that the fuqaha would speak of a particular ruling and then they'd always say, except for so-and-so or such and such a person. And the two greatest categories that were the oft-repeated categories were those that were new to Islam or those that grew up far from scholars. Meaning is that the learning opportunities that they had were not like those that lived in the great Islamic cities that had established traditions that go on for over 1,000+ years. And what I would say to my teachers is that those exceptions that are being referred to in these books are oftentimes the norm for us. And so when we come to the table to speak about community issues, I think it's very important is that we do not come with the underlying assumption is that everything is okay. I think that we have to come with the underlying assumption on the contrary, is that people are in need of healing. And when I think of that, if someone has a physical wound, let's say that their arm was cut or something like that, and it's bandaged up. If I see my brother and I come up and I hug him, if I would hug him like I would normally do, I might hurt him even further because he has a gaping wound that is hurting. And just as I need to take care of that particular individual by not causing him more pain because of that wound, I really believe that the same thing applies is that when you're speaking to people, is that we have to assume that a good percentage of people are going through an incredible amount of difficulty, and that there is a lot of not only psychological and emotional and spiritual, but also oftentimes physical pain. And it requires, in my mind, when I think about this, three things, and there's no doubt that more could be added to it. The first is there has to be a gentleness. There has to be, you could call it lutf, or you could call it rifq. Both of these beautiful words broadly convey this idea of gentleness. And what did our Prophet say, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is that gentleness will not be a part of something except that that thing will be adorned. It will become beautiful. In other words, is that by being gentle, you bring out the best of what is in someone. And just as that person that has that wound outwardly, when you embrace him or her, is that you have to be gentle so that you do not cause them more pain. And that gentleness should flow in everything that it is that we say, everything that it is also that we expect of our community. It has to be done with gentleness. And what is understood from this hadith is that the opposite of gentleness is roughness. And if we are rough, and then we are causing people to do things that we know in reality that they cannot do, you're going to cause them more problems and you're going to give them more pain. So the first thing that I really think is important, and again, in our talks and in our communities and when we interact with each other and we give each other advice, or we're just talking or we're teaching or whatever you may have it, is that there needs to be gentleness. The second thing is that I really think is that there needs to be empathy. This is one of the most beautiful qualities of all that stems from the overarching quality, which really is that the quintessential trait of our Prophet, which is rahmah, mercy. One of the dimensions of mercy, one of the many traits that flow from mercy is empathy. And the idea of empathy is that you really take the time to think about what your brother or your sister or the person that you are interacting with or even thing is going through. You put yourself in their shoes. And this is an incredibly beautiful trait that is so much needed, especially that if people are going through pain. And oftentimes when it comes to empathy, is that it's just the fact of having empathy in that relationship that creates the environment for healing. Just empathy in and of itself. I was taking this class from a Hakim from the UK, originally from India, from Pakistan rather, and it was amazing, his first lesson. It was only a weekend course, and it was a course that was quite expensive, so people had paid money to come for the weekend. And the first session was about 2 hours long, and there was roughly 60 people in the class. And he goes through asking that person that why did you come to this class and why did you want to take this class? So everyone starts to explain why they took the class. And everyone thought that he would ask maybe 2 or 3, 4, max 5 people. But then he goes from person to person, to person to person. And then when it reaches 10 or 15 people, is that all of a sudden many people started turning off. It no longer was important to them about why other people were taking the class until he finished the entire class of about 60 people. And then the 2 hours for the first session was over, and then he takes a break. And there were several people in their mind like, I paid money for this? What is this? This must be a pseudo-hakim. I came with pen and paper. I want the theory of things, that I want to get down to the nitty-gritty. What is Islamic medicine all about? And many people started to question him. And so he comes back, and he starts his session. And the first thing he says is, wow, it's really hard to listen to people, isn't it? It's really hard to listen to people, isn't it? And then everyone was just stunned, and everyone paused. And everyone said, that all of those things that I thought, I didn't realize that was actually for a purpose. He wasn't doing that intentionally, meaning that if you want to know anything about healing, and if you're going to be a healer, the very first step is to be able to actually listen to people. But in order to really listen to people, you absolutely must have this trait of empathy. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to sit and listen to them. And it actually is a very difficult thing to do, to just listen and not even speak. And most of people that you deal with, they actually know what they need to do. Sometimes they might need a little bit of advice, but it's just about that interaction. And it's about the beauty of that quality of empathy in your heart that then reaches out and touches that person that you are sitting with. And it allows them to have an environment whereby which is that they can start to change and they can start to heal. So gentleness and empathy. And then we have to include with that realistic expectations. We have to have realistic expectations of what we can do in and of our own selves. If we have families, if we have friends, community members, whoever it is that we are responsible for, the way that we look at other people, oftentimes we have totally unrealistic expectations. Is that we live in one of the most difficult times, but we expect people to be like Sayyidina Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, as that Dr. Jackson that usually references, this Abu Bakr as-Siddiq syndrome, is that we've set a bar in our community so high, is that we have unrealistic expectations. And when we have unrealistic expectations, is that it causes a lot of frustration. And I'm reminded of a story that really tells me how that we should view this. And there was one of the great scholars of Egypt who was known for having thousands of students. And when it was said to him, MashaAllah, you have so many students, he looked at the person who said that, he said, he's a student, and he's a student, and he's half of a student. And the thousands of other people, yes, they were there, but the reality is they weren't students in the sense of that high caliber of dedicating themselves fully that were then going to attain the higher degrees. And the understanding is that their affiliation with them was to maximize their own potential and to do the best they can and to die trying. That in this tradition we have these incredible examples. One of the scholars of Hadramaut, his name was Imam Abu Bakr al-Adani, that he moved to Aden and he lived and passed there, and that he was very well known and he was very wealthy. In one of the ways that he used to spend his wealth, he actually used to find young men who were wasting their time, getting in trouble, that partying and doing these types of things at night. And he would actually give them a stipend just to spend time with him at night. And whatever it is that he was doing, that he would include them in that. And that he would just have them make the tea or make the coffee or do some type of service, but he was essentially paying them to stay out of trouble. This is the way that people used to look at it. And there's much precedent for these types of approaches in our time, but we have to have that our discourse be one of gentleness empathy, and realistic expectations. And then in relation to our own internal response to other people's tribulations, I want to point this out because it's extremely important. And one of the ways that see the state of your heart is that if there's a particular individual that you just don't like that much, or maybe it's even beyond that where you have a deep sense of that hatred or antipathy towards that person, if they are tried with the tribulation, what is the state of your heart? Are you happy? Let's think about our own hearts. Can we trace back and think about a situation that we have been in, where someone that we don't particularly like, when they were tried with the tribulation, if we find joy in that, or we're happy that that happened to the person, I would even go as far to say, even if they're our enemy, we have to be very careful. It's a sign that there's a disease. And in addition to that, is that when we look at other people that going through immense tribulations, and I'm not just talking about things about health, it might even be in relation to their own deen. They might get caught up. Their lower self might get the best of them. They might fall into a number of things that are even haram. If we look at other people with the eye of arrogance, i.e. that we think that we are better than them, and we start to scorn them and disregard them, as if this is something that could not happen to us, that is very dangerous. And then in addition to that, if we go as far to condemn them, and there's a hadith of our Prophet that indicates this, is that man ayyara akhahu muslim, whoever condemns his Muslim brother, that when they fall and they fall short, is that that person will not die until that they fall into the same thing. And what it means to condemn your brother or your sister when they do something is wrong is that to think that somehow that you couldn't fall into that, or you don't want them to get out of that, or that you believe that there is no tawbah or repentance for them. Yes, that if someone does wrong that you have to dislike the wrong, but there's a difference that if you condemn them. And then is that if someone thinks when they look at the tribulations of others that somehow they are immune to that and that couldn't happen to them, this is very dangerous. It could happen to any one of us. In any one of these four things, being happy about someone's tribulations, looking arrogantly at other people, condemning them, or thinking that you are immune to that, it is likely that you're not going to die except that you're going to be tried with that same thing. This has to be our approach internally. Now, I want to tie that into the last point that I would like to make, and something that I really believe is very helpful. And there's actually a book written about it. I believe her name is Carol Dweck. It's called Mindset. And the idea that she presents here is that there are really two mindsets of the human being. You have the growth mindset and you have the fixed mindset. These are her terms. And they're completely opposite of one another, diametrically opposed. And the idea of the fixed mindset is that everything that you go through ultimately is a way of evaluating where you are in the moment. And the person who sees things as such usually believes is that they actually can't better themselves, and that they take the vicissitudes of life and things like losing a job or getting a bad grade on a test as something that will actually lower their energy to be able to strive to get better, because they see that test or whatever it is that they're going through as evaluating themselves, as opposed to the growth mindset, which is ultimately about learning and bettering the skills that we have. The growth mindset is the opposite. It's everything that you go through in life is that it's actually an opportunity. In other words, you learn to find the opportunities in the challenges. The person that gets that bad grade on the test, or they lose their job, or they have a failed relationship, is that the way that they approach that tribulation is, how can I grow? How can I learn something new? How can I shed something of the past and be able to move forward to something in the future? And this is something is that in reality we don't need an external author to tell us about. We have this understanding in our deen. We understand that the spiritual path is founded upon Adam al-Rida an nafs, never being content that you've arrived and never thinking that you can't grow any further. You can always grow further. You can always do better. But with the details that are in this book, and I recommend the read, because it also relates to how we approach not only relationships, our career, learning, and even family. How we approach that raising children and instilling in them this growth mindset, so that as they go through life, and as other people that we are interacting with, the community that we are trying to teach and help, and our own brothers and sisters and friends and family, is that with that growth mindset, is that you realize is that everything that comes your way is ultimately an opportunity. Even if you don't know why you're being tried by something, whether it's some type of punishment or an atonement or a means of raising your grade, you actually don't have to know. What matters is how you respond. And the last thing that I will say is that the beautiful thing in this is, if we have this mindset, and this ties into the title itself, this idea of falling and standing up, is that success ultimately is entering into paradise and having our Lord be content with us. So you could have someone in the world, by all means of worldly success, they are a complete failure in relation to their schooling, their career, their relationships, everything. But that person returns to Allah Jalla Jalaluhu, and Allah forgives him or her and accepts that person. And that person ultimately is a success. So this requires that we have a true understanding of what success is. And no matter how many times that we fall down, we brush ourselves off, metaphorically speaking, and we stand up and we move forward. And we continue to do this until the day that we die. And if we do that, you will be successful, ultimately with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And you are only ever a failure is that when you choose not to get up. In the slightest movement of the heart, this is what is meant, and this is why in the hadith al-shafa'ah is that we know that translates as anyone that even says La ilaha illallah once in their life will eventually attain the bliss that Allah Ta'ala has in store for the believers, but that just requires even the smallest degree of movement, or intending to have the movement of the heart, or at least the intention of having the movement in the heart, so that we can expose ourselves to the mercy of Allah. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us tawfiq and to bless our community. And may we be sources of healing for people. And may we learn, inshallah, to carry ourselves in a way and to do what it is that we need to find healing in our own lives. Jazakum Allah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.